from the Connecticut. Thank you. Thank you so much. Um, we're so happy to have Rashida Rattray-Reid with us from the Connecticut Fair Housing Center to address quite a few concerns that people might have regarding what you have rights to in terms of fair housing. So we are recording this session so that those who weren't able to make it today can attend. As we're going through the presentation, please just put anything that comes up to you in the chat, and we will definitely have time for questions at the end of the presentation. Uh, so thank you so much, Rashida, for being here. I'll have just give a brief introduction and we'll get started. Okay, I think we've got everybody here now that's in. So hello, folks, if you're just joining us, we are recording the session today. Please put any questions that you have in the chat and we will have time for Q&A at the end. We started this presentation idea with the idea that April is Fair Housing Month, and so there are a lot of rights that you have access to that you may not be aware of. So we had an in-person option, then we changed it to a virtual option. So now we've got it so that anyone can come, whether they're in person or whether they're online, and there will be access to the recording later for anyone who would like it. So without further ado, Rashida, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. It is such a pleasure to be here today. I really want to get into the meat and potatoes of this presentation because I don't want to take up too much of you guys' time with, semantics and conversation. But just a little bit about me. My name is Rashida Rattray-Reid. I am the Education and Outreach Coordinator at the Connecticut Fair Housing Center. I have been working in housing for over a decade, at various different points in housing, from being a housing counselor, from doing community development for the city of Waterbury. And also, moving on to actually doing some solid advocacy work here with the Connecticut Fair Housing Center. So, I've been around in the housing sphere for a while, and it's really my pleasure. I love educating people. I love teaching people about their fair housing rights. And I really love putting the power back into the hands of the people because that's what I feel like education truly does. It gives people the power to be able to advocate on their own behalf. So, just a little disclaimer here, this live broadcast is protected by copyright law. Any unauthorized reproduction or broadcast of this video without the express written consent of the Connecticut Fair Housing Center is illegal and punishable by law. If you're using software or other automated tools for note-taking or recording, please disable them if you're able to. This presentation is literally just general informational and educational stuff. I don't want you guys to take it and think that it is legal advice. I am not authorized to give you legal advice, for I am not an attorney or a lawyer. I am just an education and outreach coordinator that is passionate about giving people information. It does not constitute legal advice. This content is not a substitute for consulting a qualified legal professional regarding your specific circumstances. I am not able to give you a more specific toned down view. So for example, if you have a specific example of discrimination, or you have a client that you're working with and you have a scenario, I am not able to give you that one-on-one detailed advice in a way that a qualified legal professional would be able to. Furthermore, participating in this training does not create an attorney-client relationship between you or your organization and the Connecticut Fair Housing Center, nor does it create a conflict of interest with any future or current clients of the Connecticut Fair Housing Center. Any information that you provide during this training is not confidential. And what I mean by that is if you do happen to provide me that scenario that you're seeing with yourself or one of your clients that you're working with, I will bring that information back to the powers that be at the Connecticut Fair Housing Center for a little bit more insight or to connect with you one-on-one. You should not act or refrain from acting based on the information presented without seeking appropriate professional counsel or an attorney that is licensed in your jurisdiction. So this is a big disclaimer. There's a lot that happens with these presentations, especially when they go live. So we just want to make sure that we're letting you guys know of, what legal ramifications or lack of exists because of your presence in this presentation. Now that all the legal jargon is out of the way, let's get to the fun stuff. So let's talk about fair housing. What is fair housing? Fair housing is the right to choose housing that is free from unlawful discrimination. We have federal and state protections that were put in place to ensure that everyone has equal access to housing, no matter the housing transaction, whether it is you're trying to rent, or you're in the process of buying, or you're in the process of accessing lending services or real estate services, insurance, or even accessing shelter, you do have protections under the Fair Housing Act. It is supported by the Fair Housing Act of 1968, and it prohibits discrimination in housing and housing related services based on your membership in a protected class. I will never give you a term or throw a term out there that I don't define. So we will talk about what protected classes are in a couple of slides, but I also want it to be clear that it's the Fair Housing Act doesn't just protect you when you're seeking housing. It also protects you against retaliation if you have filed a fair housing complaint or if you are participating in a fair housing investigation. So there's a breadth of protection that the Fair Housing Act provides, and we're going to get into what those protections look like as we progress the presentation. So, a little bit about the organization that I'm representing today, the Connecticut Fair Housing Center. Our mission is to ensure that everyone has equal access to housing opportunities in the state of Connecticut that are free from discrimination. We focus on these intricate ways that different forms of oppression are connected and how these connections ultimately contribute to housing discrimination. So, we're not just looking at the instance of housing discrimination. We're also looking at, your positionality, the intersectionality of the individual. Is this person, for example, a person with a disability? Are they a Black or Brown individual? Are they a family with children? We're always looking at the different way that different identities collide and how those different identities are also being oppressed, not just in housing discrimination in general. The work we do has expanded as the needs of our residents have expanded. We were started in 1994, and I could tell you that the cases that we were seeing in 1994 are not the exact same cases that we're seeing today in 2026. We always keep our ear to the ground, and we're always trying to connect with residents, community partners, organizations that are doing similar work, or even organizations that are not doing similar work. We're always trying to make sure that we're connecting with the community to hear what is happening, to hear what people are experiencing, and to see where we should be pointing this fair housing needle next. And the way that we do this work is broken down into a couple of categories, which I'll go over now. We do legal enforcement. So we do fair housing investigation and enforcement, foreclosure prevention, and unfair trade practices litigation. One thing that I like to note is that there's no one size fits all for fair housing enforcement. There's no across the board way that we enforce the Fair Housing Act because it is a case by case basis, and every case has its differences and its nuances. So we're always investigating different ways to enforce the Fair Housing Act. We're also offering foreclosure prevention to our Connecticut homeowners that are at risk of or going through the foreclosure process. The community education piece of the work that we do is broken down into two categories. It's education and outreach, which is what I do passionately at that. I love getting into communities, attending community events, talking to people, meeting them where they are to be able to provide them information on their fair housing rights and how to enforce that. We also provide legal support for tenant movements. As you know, in the state of Connecticut, there is a law that protects individuals who are desirous of organizing as a tenant, whether you want to create a tenant union or join one, you are protected under that law. So we're always trying to provide legal support for tenants who are interested in evoking that protection. Lastly, we always like to keep in mind that there is a big systemic advocacy piece of the work that we do. And we do that by public policy advocacy and litigation that attacks these systemic issues. In a couple of slides, we'll talk about some of the issues that we have in housing, kind of how did they come to be and what we're doing to kind of push back against those issues. So in order to make sure that everyone has equal access to housing and housing opportunities, Congress passed the Fair Housing Act of 1968, which prohibits discrimination based on your membership in a protected class in all forms of housing transactions. And we went over what those housing transactions were a couple of slides ago. But a protected class can be defined as a group of people who share characteristics that are protected from discrimination. Connecticut has taken the step to add some additional statewide fair housing laws that has really taken the step to protect vulnerable members of our communities. And what those protected classes look like is federally, every state across the country, it is a violation of the Fair Housing Act to discriminate against anyone in any housing transaction based on their race, color, national origin, sex, disability, religion, or familial status, which is the presence of children within a family. Connecticut specifically has taken the step to add ancestry, marital status, age over 18, sexual orientation, lawful source of income. So whether someone is using a subsidy to pay their rent or their mortgage, SSI, SSDI, and Section 8 are the most common examples of that. Gender identity and expression, veteran status, and your status as a victim of domestic violence has been added to our state-specific protected class list. Now, I like to highlight that none of these protected classes got here by accident. There was advocacy that had to happen. There was work that had to happen on the ground where advocates, fair housing advocates in general, and the community has advocated for these protected classes to be added. And it's our hope that we are continually expanding on these protected classes lists, right? That we're not shrinking them, that we're also adding more vulnerable populations that are facing discrimination to these lists. Now, as quickly as I've given Connecticut a pat on the back, I still have to kind of bear in mind that even though we have some of the strongest fair housing protections in the country, we are still one of the most segregated states in the country, with 67% of our population of color living in 8% of Connecticut's towns. People with disabilities and people who have housing vouchers, we see at the Connecticut Fair Housing Center experience discrimination at higher rates than every other protected class. And what this figure, the 67% living in 8% of Connecticut's towns, looks like on a map is this, where if you can see the teal or the darker shaded areas of this map are representative of our percent of non-white residents by census tract. So we have heavy concentration in a lot of the cities that are easy to discern on this map: Stamford, Bridgeport, Waterbury, New Haven, Meriden, Hartford. These are where our percent of non-white residents by census tract are heavily focused. But I do want to highlight that these gray or lightly shaded areas of the map that I'm kind of dragging this pointer over are also parts of Connecticut. And this gray or lightly shaded would indicate that there is less than 15% of non-white residents by census tract in these areas. As much as I would like to say that fair housing is the magic wand that we can wave to make this map look more diverse, we know that there are a lot of different pieces to this housing puzzle that we would need to fall in place, right? We need more deeply affordable housing. We need more accessible housing. We need to look into different housing types. The Fair Housing Act is really remarkable because once that housing is developed, once those structures are in place, it opens the floodgates so that there is equal access for everyone who is looking to access or to be able to be a part of that housing without the burden of undue discrimination, unlawful discrimination. And we didn't get here by accident, right? There is decades of discriminatory policy that was put in place that has affected the way that our housing looks today. There is a 2 hour long presentation that we often host called 100 Years of Fair Housing History, where we really get into the nooks and crannies of decade by decade, how policies really shaped our built environment. But for the purposes of this presentation, we're going to condense this. So we're going to talk a little bit about worker housing that was built before and during the Industrial Revolution, where factories really developed our communities and there were no formal zoning laws in place. Well, unfortunately, those factory built housing often excluded non-white workers. Pictured here is the Colt factory housing that's built in 1910. And that started a pattern of excluding people of color, poor and migrant families from being able to live close to where they worked. So we move into the 1920s and the 1930s, and to protect the real estate during the Great Depression, the FHA, which is the Federal Housing Administration, created the HOLC, which is the Homeowners Loan Corporation, and that assessed the risk of lending. City by city, town by town, these two government created agencies went and color coded by race. Um, Assessing the risk of lending in each city and town. The green and blue areas of this map were seen as desirable, and these were the areas that are mostly white families were living, mostly our white population was focused, whereas the yellow and red areas of this map were seen as hazardous and not fit for real estate lending, where our poor and migrant families, our black and brown families were primarily focused. This process was called redlining, and non-white neighborhoods were often redlined. And even in 2026, we still feel the reverb of redlining, where in historically redlined cities and towns, we see underbanking, we see lower credit scores, and we see lower home ownership rates. We move on to post-World War II development and how that was subsidized with federal money and billions of dollars poured into the federal government. And this is where this American dream was created, where the suburbs were rapidly developed. Meanwhile, we, United States, we, not you and I, but we continue to disinvest in these densely populated areas where our population of color and our poor and migrant families were focused. Non-white families were often excluded from home ownership during this time. So we're continuing to make the choice of who gets to access resources and who goes without those resources. Simultaneously, while that is happening, the suburbs are being developed at a rapid rate. There's a greater dependency on the automobile, and we need to be able to build structures to support that. So highway development starts, and highway development basically says that we're going to develop these highways through these densely packed urban areas of town because they're unsightly, they're full of crime. I'm sure you've heard this canard before. While that highway development is happening, urban renewal is also coming to decimate non-white urban neighborhoods. So when we look at what we're seeing in housing today, the struggles, the confusion, all of the disjointedness that's happening in housing today, I want to be clear that none of these things exist in a vacuum. None of this was accidental. Racial and economic segregation was not accidental. Private development supported by public policy actions and perpetuated by racial discrimination created and maintain our segregated neighborhoods. So, just a moment to jump back into the meat and potatoes of this presentation, where we discuss forms of discrimination. How does discrimination show up in one's housing search? I'm going to give you some examples of how to identify housing discrimination in a couple of slides, but I want to highlight two forms of discrimination under the Fair Housing Act. The first being differential treatment, which is treating people differently because of their membership in a protected class. This often shows up in really more so individual type of interactions. It's how the individual is treated. So if we go back to our protected class slide, differential treatment often sounds like I don't rent to people with disabilities or I don't accept Section 8, right? It is something that really sounds more targeted at the individual. Whereas going back to our slide, we have disparate impact, which is a neutral rule or a policy that has a disparate impact or a greater negative effect on members of a protected class. So going back to our protected class list, disparate impact would show up as a blanket policy. So, for example, let's say a housing provider had a blanket ban on anyone with any type of criminal record or arrest record. At face value, that may not seem to have a or be a violation of the Fair Housing Act, because we don't see individuals with criminal backgrounds explicitly represented here on this list. But just by having that rule in place, you violate the Fair Housing Act through disparate impact, because a blanket ban or policy on anyone that has a criminal record has a greater negative effect on our race and color protected classes, not just in Connecticut, but nationally, because we're able to prove that people of color are arrested, convicted at higher rates than any other race or color. So, disparate impact is really a way that we're able to rope individuals under our fair housing umbrella for protections, even if they're not explicitly stated in our fair housing protected classes. And how this shows up in your housing search varies, right? These are ways that we see more commonly housing discrimination show up. It shows up in the misrepresentation of the availability of housing. This occurs when a housing provider falsely tells a prospective tenant or buyer that a property is not available when it actually is. For example, a landlord has a vacant apartment. A person of a certain national origin calls to inquire. The landlord tells them, "I'm sorry, that unit is fully occupied or it's being rented," but then immediately tells a different looking or different sounding caller that the apartment is available for viewing. We've seen refusal to rent or sell. This is a direct denial of housing despite the applicant being otherwise qualified. For example, they meet the income or the credit requirements. For example, a well-qualified single mother with 2 minor children applies for an apartment. The landlord states, "We don't rent to families with children," or "This building is for adults only," citing an illegal preference against familial status. We've seen unequal terms or conditions. This involves treating one applicant or tenant differently than others after they have expressed interest or have been approved based on a protected characteristic. A common example of this is a landlord charges a person with a disability a higher security deposit than other tenants, or charges a minority tenant higher rent for the exact same apartment, or imposes stricter rules on a family with children than they do with a family without children. Uses of threats, intimidation, or coercion involves using hostile actions, verbal abuse, or undue pressure to interfere with a person's enjoyment of a dwelling or to force them out. An example of this is a property manager makes unwanted sexual advances towards a tenant, implying or explicitly stating that the tenant's refusal will lead to a rent increase or termination of the lease. This is also seen as quid pro quo sexual harassment. Discriminatory advertisement occurs when a public notice, sign, or ad expresses a preference for or limitation for or against a protected class. For example, an online ad for an apartment says "no Section 8 or any other government assistance accepted," or terms such as "seeking quiet Christian renter" or "must speak fluent English" are examples of discriminatory advertisements. Lastly, we have discrimination with a smile, which can be seen as steering. This is often the most subtle and difficult to prove form of discrimination, where a housing provider uses seemingly friendly or helpful language to disguise a discriminatory motive. An example of this is a real estate agent tells a client, "I know you're interested in this area, but you might feel more comfortable in a neighborhood with more people that look like you," an attempt to steer them away from a particular desirable location based on their race or national origin. All of these are violations of the Fair Housing Act, and all of these are different ways that housing discrimination can show up in one's housing search. How do we at the Connecticut Fair Housing Center handle complaints of discrimination? So we're always encouraging individuals to call our intake line. All you really need to report housing discrimination is a feeling that something is off. So you go to a house, one of these examples that happened in the previous slides occurs, and you feel funny about it and you give us a call. You call our intake line, you will either leave a voicemail or maybe the intake specialist answers when you call. You will provide them as much information as possible about the incident, and they will take that and go to our attorneys to get a little bit more feedback from them. From when they go to the attorneys will determine if discrimination occurred, and they may be able to see if they can offer counseling and support to the individual who was discriminated against. They may be able to offer advice or explain any relevant fair housing laws. They might be able to provide free legal representation to victims of discrimination. We will definitely investigate the claims of discrimination, and if we determine that there is evidence of a violation of the law, the center will be able to kind of work to change that practice or obtain compensation for the victims. So I'm going to take a beat. I do see that there is a something in the chat. Okay, yep, we will have a recording of this presentation for others who are not able to make it. But I'm going to take a beat to just kind of discuss what we'll be talking about next. We will be talking about fair housing rights of people with disabilities. We're going to talk about reasonable accommodations and modifications. We're going to talk about fair housing for the justice impacted. We're going to talk about eviction records, and we're going to round off with limited income and credit history, in which we're going to discuss lawful source of income protections, and we're going to talk about financial literacy and credit counseling. Please feel free to all of our participants who are joining us via Zoom right now. If you do have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat box, and we will definitely have time for a robust Q&A after. So, under the Fair Housing Act, we define a disability as a condition that substantially impacts one or more major life functions for an extended period of time or to a great degree. A condition that can be readily seen, or a physical disability, or something that is not readily seen, a mental disability. Major life functions could be walking, talking, eating, breathing, but also self-care and one's ability to pay their bills are also major life functions that can be affected by the presence of a disability. For an extended period of time or to a great degree, meaning that this person could have had this disability all their life or for a long period of time, or it could have been something that recently happened that has caused this individual to be affected to a great degree. Some examples of disability discrimination are, you can't live here because there's no one here to take care of you. I'd like to rent you, but my insurance will go up. How can I be sure that you will pay the rent? We don't want alcoholics or drug addicts here, even if they're in recovery programs. We have a no pets rule, and that includes your guide dog. I want to see your medical records. And your wheelchair will damage the carpet and walls, and you won't be able to get out if there's a fire. Any individual that has a disability has the right to request a reasonable accommodation or modification. It is up to the individual with the disability to create the nexus. The nexus is simply described as the request or the need for the accommodation and what needs to be done to fulfill that, right? Like, what is the limitation and what can be done to satisfy that limitation? A reasonable accommodation, I just want you to think of it as a change in a rule. A good example of this is assigned parking spots. Let's say a housing provider assigns all of their tenants parking spots, but an individual with a disability, a physical disability that uses a mobility aid, has a parking spot that is further away from their unit. Example of the reasonable accommodation that they would request would be a change to the parking spot to get them a closer parking spot that is nearer to their residence. They usually do not cost money. It's unreasonable if it causes an undue financial or administrative burden, but the housing provider cannot just flat out deny a request because it is unreasonable. We really want this to be an interactive process between landlord and tenant. So we're going to talk about what to do with unreasonable requests in a second. But another example of a reasonable accommodation would be granting an individual a service or a support animal. A reasonable modification is a change in a physical structure to address a limitation resulting from a disability. The more common examples of these are building a ramp, widening a doorway, lowering kitchen cabinets, or other changes to make a unit more accessible. Reasonable modifications do cost money. And normally it is the tenant's responsibility to pay for the reasonable modification. It is unreasonable if it causes an undue administrative burden or a structural concern. But even if the request is unreasonable, the housing provider cannot just flat out deny the request. The housing provider still has to work and maintain this interactive process. So an example that I usually use is, let's say a individual with a mobile physical disability and who uses a mobility device may ask their housing provider to build an elevator in their unit. Well, that's probably going to cause an undue financial and administrative burden, and it possibly might cause a structural concern. But the housing provider can't just say no. The housing provider should be trying to work with that tenant to see if there's a medium that they can reach. So, housing provider might say something as, I can't really build you an elevator in the middle of this unit, but I can install a lift on the stairs to make it easier for you to get up and down the stairs. Because the burden of proof will be on the housing provider if that tenant does call us at the center and report them for not acknowledging or not moving on that request quickly or in a reasonable amount of time. So, to request a reasonable accommodation or a reasonable modification, there are no magic words or specific forms required to initiate a request for an accommodation. If the disability is obvious and the need for the request is obvious, the accommodation should be granted. For example, if I am that person that has a mobility aid or a mobility device and I need a ramp installed so that I'm able to get in and out of my property, the disability is obvious and the need for the request is obvious, so it should be granted. The housing provider can request a letter from a treating medical professional if the disability is not obvious. The request never has to disclose the details of the disability. It only needs to state the limitation and what needs to be done to address that limitation. So we talk a little bit about fair housing for the justice impacted, and we mentioned earlier how a blanket no arrest or no conviction policy violates the Fair Housing Act through disparate impact. Even narrower prohibition that excludes any person with only certain types of convictions may still violate the Fair Housing Act. An individualized assessment is likely to have a less discriminatory effect than a blanket policy. And it is the housing provider that should be conducting this individualized assessment. And in that assessment, three questions should be asked to evaluate a prospective tenant's criminal record. When was the offense? What is the nature and the severity of the offense? And what has happened since the offense occurred? And this really gives individuals that are a part of that are justice impacted a more equal shot, a more equal chance at being able to attain housing despite having a criminal record. Talking about challenges in finding housing with eviction records, unfortunately, eviction records do not expire. But fortunately, Connecticut is a judicial state. So all evictions have to follow a judicial process. The housing provider must give an individual a notice to quit, which cites their intention to evict that individual. Our suggestion is that if you are someone who has received a notice to quit, you immediately contact legal services for help. Some factors that we ask people, property owners, landlords to consider is the length of time since the eviction. How long has passed since that person has that eviction on their record? What is the reason for that eviction? Unfortunately, in Connecticut, we are a no-fault eviction state, meaning that a person can get evicted if they're not on a yearly lease and they're on a month to month, and the housing provider uses lapse of time as a reason for that eviction. And is there any current rental history that supports good tenancy? For individuals who are facing eviction, we do have some additional resources. We've mentioned statewide legal services, but Connecticut does have a right to counsel program that offers legal representation to individuals that are in high evicting zip codes. You can literally just type right to counsel program CT into Google and it will pop up with the website that will give you more information on that. We also direct people to ctlawhelp.org if they're looking to learn a little bit more about the eviction process and read some literature on that. And lastly, we at the Connecticut Fair Housing Center have raised up a pro se guide. You could see the website here. It is cteviction.guide for individuals who are at any stage of the eviction process. It is a self-help tool for individuals to navigate that process a little bit easier. When it comes to finding housing and credit history, unfortunately, there's no legislation or law in place in Connecticut or nationally that stops a housing provider from evoking a minimum or maximum credit limit. But what we aim to do is to put the power back into the hands of the person, right? Of the individual seeking housing. So please request a copy of your credit report for free at annualcreditreport.com and review it for anything that is inaccurate or for anything that's in collections. See if you can make a plan for repayment and seek a HUD certified credit counseling service. You can find a listing on the Connecticut Housing Finance Authority or CHFA's website of their housing counseling agencies that offer financial fitness counseling. This is up to 3 sessions with a HUD certified housing counselor, and they're able to sit down with you, review your credit report, build you a budget, explain some things in your credit report that you may not even be able to understand, and kind of help to kind of empower you and get you back on track when it comes to your credit report and your credit history. Lastly, we're going to round off with challenges in finding housing when it comes to lawful source of income. So in Connecticut, it is illegal to deny anyone housing if they're using a subsidy to pay their rent. And as we said earlier, Section 8, SSI, and SSDI are the most common examples of that. Housing providers often find another way to deny housing when they learn a prospective tenant has a subsidy. So we encourage clients not to disclose that they are using a subsidy until they are directly applying for the unit. A lot of the times, individuals will disqualify themselves in that first initial phone call to see if the unit is available. You don't even know if you like this unit yet. You've never seen it. You haven't been to the neighborhood. So we often tell individuals, get to the point where you are ready to apply for the unit and then put in that application and let the housing provider know that you are using a subsidy. We also encourage caseworkers to assist clients with asking housing providers to not consider credit or income if they have a housing subsidy because it's counterproductive. Lastly, when to call us. If you believe that you or a client or someone that you know has faced housing discrimination, if you would like to set up a fair housing training, if you would like to join legislative advocacy efforts that you see that we're involved in, if you or someone you know is facing foreclosure, or if you would like to learn more about the investigative arm of our work, please feel free to call us. And that number that you can reach us at is here. You could call our intake line at 860-247-4400. That's for English and Spanish translations. If you need additional translators, you could call our toll-free line at 888-247-4401. You can also report housing discrimination by visiting our website. We have a portal for that, ctfairhousing.org/report-housing-discrimination. And you could feel free to check out our website for a bunch of other resources. We have resources for homeowners, resources for individuals who are interested in renting. Both of our moving forward guides are geared towards helping homeowners and renters. And we also have foreclosure resources. How to protect yourself if you're going through foreclosure is one of our guides that we have free of charge on our website. All of our services are free of charge to Connecticut residents and renters. And, it's really, really a pleasure to be in the space, to be able to give this presentation. I hope that you were able to take something from it and just know that you do have the right to access housing that is safe, that is affordable. As long as you can afford that housing, you have the right to access it. So you should not be swayed away from housing due to housing discrimination. And if you do feel like you have been discriminated against, if you do feel like there is, a housing provider out there that is perpetuating discriminatory actions, please feel free to call our intake line or report that housing discrimination online. I'm going to leave this up for a little bit longer. I see that there is something that popped up into the chat box. And I see that question, how can we determine other tenants' rents to compare with our own? I do believe that there's a tool online that talks about the area median income, the AMI. So you're able to kind of get online and use that tool that talks about the AMI and talks about the average rent in that area. What does support for tenant unions look like? It looks like meeting tenants where they are. So when it comes to tenant organizing, a lot of the time tenants feel like they exist in a vacuum. And that is the most untrue thing ever. If you are experiencing a lack of action or a lack of urgency with, things that a landlord is dealing with regards to you, for example, health concerns such as mold or not fixing things in the apartment that you're living in, you are probably not the only one that's experiencing that. So really support for those tenants or tenant unions looks like meeting that tenant that may be having that complaint where they are, and also going around to other tenants that are also renting from that landlord that may be also in different units, and kind of seeing what their experiences are, bringing those tenants together so that they could coalesce and that they could exchange those stories, and then trying to figure out what are the legal next steps that they can take. Um, for example, if there is an exorbitant rent increase, that legal support for those tenants would look like, well, is there a fair rent commission that is established in their municipality? How can we get these people over, these tenants over to that fair rent commission? How can we file a complaint through that to hold the housing provider accountable? It may look like talking to those tenants about, engaging their local health department on some of their concerns. It may look like helping those tenants who have been displaced due to a fire relocate, and, citing the landlord's responsibility in helping them to relocate. So there's a bunch of different ways that that support of tenant unions looks like. It really just depends on that, specific union or that specific body of tenants and the complaints that they're having. Hope I was able to answer those two questions. Please feel free to drop any more that you have in the chat box.
This is so great, Rashida. Thank you so much for this wealth of information. It's clear you're very passionate about what you do, and we're very fortunate to have this resource in Connecticut. It also is good to know that you're connected to so many other departments and other entities that can help. So even though you began the presentation with you're not a lawyer, you can certainly access lawyers for people who need them. So I think the contact info is great. Please, everyone, feel free to share this. I will send out the recording when it's ready, along with the contact info, and we'll get it out to as many people as we can in terms of our neighbors and other people who might need it. So
Yes, thank you so much. And if there's anyone that you feel like could benefit from a fair housing training, any local organizations that you know of, even groups of like parents, I present to anyone. I could be there in person, I could present virtually. You just let me know and I will try my best to coordinate that. So if you are in this presentation or even after the fact, if you're watching this, this recording and you're thinking to yourself, hey, person A or organization A could possibly benefit from hearing this or being in the room with Rashida or learning more about the Connecticut Fair Housing Center, please feel free to reach out. I'll also make sure that my contact information is provided with Rachel. Rachel will gladly give it out. And yeah, let's get working. I would love to, continue to spread this information to the people who need it the most.
thank you so much for taking the time. Um, and we thank you for your time, everyone, today, spending it with us. And please follow up in my email if you have any further questions. Thank you, Rashida, and thank you, everyone, for joining us. Have a good day.
Thank you, everyone.